Hey, what's going on, everybody? I'm just working on a new track right now. It's just an intro and one drop with an unfinished break. But I'm about to start incorporating some sidechain compression into my track. I figured I'd record a video on that. Now, what I'm about to show you is something that uses stock Ableton effects to do so. By the time I finish this track, I will use a different technique called volume shaping using an third-party plugin to do so, which you'd have to buy. So I figured this would be a little bit better for people who usually don't have all these extra plugins. And the reason why I don't do that right off the bat is because to do the volume shaping technique that I do, I need all my kick and snare, my drums to be complete. So when I make the trigger for it, I don't have to change anything. So using the stock Ableton compressor, I can achieve my sidechain compression and work and just follow the kick and snare in the song to duck out all my other sounds. And if I want to change a kick in my kick track or location of a snare, I don't have to do an extra step as far as adjusting the trigger as well. So let me show you how I do that. So I got all my bass sounds grouped together so I can mix them and limit them in a way through grouping that you would do sort of like a bussing technique. Um, but what that does for me now, as far as for the sidechain, is it allows me to upload one compressor to my bass group and affect all my bass sounds at once through one compressor, sidechaining with the kick and snare. So if you go over to audio effects, you type in COMP for compressor, pops up, add that to my bass group, um, hit the sidechain function. Now I have my kick and snare grouped together in this group called K and S. That way, again, I can sort of, do a final mix on them together, get them to hit equally as loud and have a similar amount of impact with each other, a similar dynamic relationship with each other, so that the kick is not overpowering or the snare is not overpowering. But what that also does for me here is allow me to select one audio input where both my kick and snare are coming through. If you did not have your kick and snare grouped, you would only be able to add one input, so you'd have to use two compressors, and you could do that. And you'd set one compressor to your kick and one compressor to your snare. So how I like to set it up, I just leave the ratio on as 2 because I'm not really using it for compression per se, but more for this side chaining, which is really more of a volumetric thing in general. Your sub and your bass in these electronic songs are very loud, or at least you want them to be, right? Everyone's music's kind of like that. Um, but it's hard to get that kick and snare to live within all that without using this technique. Now, obviously, I didn't invent this, so it's a technique that everybody's using um, that allows that kick and snare to cut through the mix. Let me show you a little clip of this track of what it sounds like, but before I do anything with it, and so you can see what I'm working with here.
Ain't no competition when I'm in my zone. Competition when I'm in my zone. In my zone, gone. In my zone, gone. In my zone. Ain't no competition when I'm in my zone. In my zone, gone. In my zone, gone. In my zone.
All right, so I got this. I'm gonna solo mute this sub and the vocals for now, so we can just kind of listen to what happens with the bass group. So I'm gonna turn this on. Ratio 2, like I said, not trying to overcompress this stuff. You got three knobs here that you're mainly worried about. That's your ratio, the attack, and the release. The attack is going to be how fast uh, you know this compressor acts on the ducking of the sound when the kick hits. Putting more time on this attack will only cause a delay in the sidechain effect. So I like it to be instant. So the lowest value you can go to is 0.01 milliseconds, and I like to set my ratio to about 30 milliseconds and my threshold to minus 30 dB. Now, for me, like the overly sidechain sound is not necessarily, you know, my favorite. I just like it to do its job. I want my kick and snare to punch through my mix, and you need the other sounds to do so, especially the sub. There's sub frequencies in your kick, and you can't have the sub sounding with the kick sounding at the same exact time. It's only going to become muddy, and it won't work out on that club stereo. If you when your track's played very loud in front of people. So this is kind of the sweet spot for me. I will play around with the release time based on the BPM, but I found that at 150 BPM or so, 30 milliseconds works. So let's play a clip and I'll show you how that sounds. All right, comparison with it off. So obviously, the kick and snare cut through pretty decently, when you don't have everything else in the track playing, because now we've relieved some of the headroom, and the mix here is not terrible. So my kick is actually louder than the bass sounds. So they're kind of cut through, but you can hear how as soon as I turn the compressor on, you can kind of hear that ducking. So let me play it again. I'll turn the compressor on and off. So as you can hear, it's starting to duck it out when I turn the compressor on, and that kick just cuts through even clearer than it was before, which is what you want. You want the kick and snare in electronic dance music to be the loudest thing in your track. That's the thing that people dance to the most, and you need that to cut through. So why 30 milliseconds though? So for me, I think that you need a true sidechain of at least a 16th note. Um, uh, an eighth is max. Kind of quarter is going to be too much. But why 30 milliseconds? Um, and it's because if I show you the audio waveform here, that if you click this third box here, it'll show you um, how the ducking is actually happening with the sidechain. So let's see what's going on there. You notice how when the kick sounds, it comes back faster than the snare does. Well, that's because the kick sound has a certain duration that it ducks for, and the snare sound has reverb on it that I have over here. If I come over here, I have some reverb on my snare. So that snare is sounding longer, which means it's affecting the sidechain compression longer. Uh, so, and then it's like I was saying for the 16th note, um, this is because this isn't volume shaping, and we can't just say I want it to duck for a 16th note. That kick sounds for a certain amount of time, and this is just something I found with the kicks I use, and it could vary depending on if you have a longer kicking, more of a throbby kick. You might have to reduce this so that the sounds come back faster and it doesn't sound overly exaggerated. So if I turn the milliseconds up, you'll see what I'm talking about as far as the sounds coming back. So if I go all the way, they almost never have time to come back because the kick and snare keep sounding. It's going to keep on affecting it, keep on pulling that, ducking that sound down. But just around here, like 300 or so, you can hear it's trying to come back up before the next kick or snare hits, but the release is so long that it doesn't allow for it to come back to full volume. So check that out again. And I'm going to lower the release over time, and you'll see how it starts to bring the sound back up to full volume. Because essentially that's what we want. We want the kick to cut through, and we want the sound to come back. In a ratio and a timing that works out nice in the mix and doesn't sound ridiculous, in my opinion. To me, that sounds pretty decent as far as getting that kick and snare to cut through, ducking the sounds out, having them come back at full volume, with also having that slight noticeable amount of sidechain. But I'm only gonna do this, like I said, while I write the song, and then eventually I'll do the volume shaping, which will be a little bit more accurate. But let's talk about these milliseconds for a second on the release. How do I pick the proper timing uh, as far as the milliseconds go in a song? And everything, every effect, reverb, delay, they all give you milliseconds as far as for your parameters that you can affect. So I just want to make everybody aware that you can calculate, the milliseconds of a quarter note or an eighth note or 16th note based on the BPM. So I have a website. I just Googled it. This is muted.io, BPM to MS, and I already typed in the value 150 BPM, and it tells me that a 16th note is 100 milliseconds. So if you want to start getting a little bit more accurate with your delays, if you want to have a true quarter note delay, or a 16th note delay, or you want to have your reverb, be a half note, with the snare or something, you could actually, you know, calculate this timing. And if I wanted to have a quarter note delay, I would set my delay to 400 milliseconds. If I wanted my reverb to, have a decay of a half note, it'd be 800 milliseconds at 150 BPM. So realistically, with the 1/16th being 100 milliseconds, you know, um, if I wanted this to be super accurate, I could actually input the 100 milliseconds to this compressor, and then in theory, my sound would duck out for 100 milliseconds, right? But I can tell you that that's not going to work out because of the previous thing that I said before about the kick sounding longer than a 16th note. The snare with the reverb sounds longer than that 100 milliseconds. So for me, if I have the 100 millisecond release on it, the release comes in once the sound stops. So the kick goes, and it's not till it stops sounding over time that the release will begin to come back. So however long your kick sounds, however long your snare sounds, this milliseconds release is only going to tack on time to that. So let's just see how that sounds at 100 milliseconds. And honestly, it's not entirely terrible, but I know based on everything that I just told you that it's going to be longer in 100 milliseconds by default. But there's sort of a way you can get around that. And I'm going to kind of take you through this next step of what people do, because the kick and snare, you really would want to have. I don't want that reverb on the snare to affect the sidechain. I only want that transient from that snare to really cut through and affect the other sounds in that way. So what people will do is create like a ghost kick, they call it, and it will end up triggering this sidechain. Again, I wouldn't do this step until I'm done with the track, because if I decide I want to add more kicks or less kicks or whatever inside my breakbeat, I'm gonna have to also take an extra step and affect that trigger track. So that's why I recommend, if you're gonna do this next step, which I do recommend doing that, you wait till you're done writing the song before you do that. But let me show you how you would go about doing that, so you can put a sound in to trigger the kick and the snare when they happen and affect the side chain identically for when the kick hits and the snare hits. So anyways, I'm gonna go over here to where my kick and snare is, and I'm going to add in a MIDI track. So let's go like this. Control Shift T. Uh, for Microsoft users, uh, Control Shift T will add the MIDI track um, as far as commands. And then I'm going to add a drum rack. That way I can input the information from my kick into this one. So what you're going to want to do is go to find some kind of sound. Um, let's see, click maybe, kick. 808's got a click sound. You could even use like a tight rim shot snare, but I mean we could play around with it. So I'm gonna add this 808 click to the drum rack also, and you can just see it's just a quick transient. Um, let's do, I'll add the 909. Let's see what that looks like. This obviously is going to sound, the sound starts and finishes a lot faster. See, this to me almost has too much going on. We probably won't use that. Um, let me see, rim, maybe this one. Let's see. Rim, these should all be stock Ableton sounds. But essentially you want to find something, uh, that's short and sweet that can do the job of the sidechain. So I'm just adding in several different things that we can give a try. So I don't like this that much because notice how the transient is not really where you'd want it to be. Um, as far as for the sidechain, this will add kind of a delay to it visually just looking at it. So maybe we'll just go with this 808 click noise. But anyways, so I got this here. Um, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my MIDI information from my kick. I gotta go to one bar here. I'm gonna highlight all this, copy. Okay. I'm going to go down to where I just copied from, same time in the track. Now what I'm also gonna do is combine all this for my next step here. So you come over here, you right click on it, hit consolidate. That will combine all that MIDI information. And what I'm gonna do is, because actually right now in this track, the way I'm working, my snare is actually audio. So that means that within that kick track, I do not have any MIDI information for where the snare hits. So let me just move this down to, we're going to try that 808 click noise first. So now all my kicks are on that 808 sound, 808 click noise. And then I'm going to have to go in and add the snares in where they would go. So let me do something. This is kind of hard to work like this. Um, gonna be between these first two hits. So I'm gonna go, I want this to be the same size, 16, 3.5, 4.5, 5.5. Okay, all right. And then what I can do there, now that I have my snares inputted where they're supposed to be, I'm gonna highlight this, right? For those 4 bars, Control D, duplicate it out across the whole beat. All right. And then now that I got it across the whole beat, I'm going to take that and move it down with the arrow to the 808 layer. And if I look at this, you can see I have snare hits right here, right here, right here. And at every snare hit now I've inputted MIDI information. I'm going to try something. I don't believe that the MIDI works into that side chain. I think we're going to have to bounce it out to audio. It's been a little while since I did this because I said like I said, I used the volume shaping, but let me just see some. So that's now track number 7. I would change that name to maybe Trigger or Ghost Kick, but for right now we just look, it's track 7. Now I got a sidechain with track 7, and let's see if that actually will affect it like that. And I would want to mute this, that way you don't hear that click layer. So that's interesting. So it actually does work with the MIDI information. I would have expected that you had to use the audio, but so now you can see that this drum rack right here, track 7, is muted, and it's affecting the kick and snare um, in the same exact fashion. Notice how the snare doesn't take longer for that sound to come from the threshold to the yellow line. So let's give that a go. You can sort of play around with these filters, these EQs. I actually do tend to use this one here, this sort of shark fin. I believe that it comes back in a more pleasing manner. It's just a filter for the sidechain. You can play around with them, and I'm going to be honest, I don't entirely know exactly how it affects it. I like this one personally. Again, using your ears. You could plug in 100 milliseconds, like I said, and be like, oh, it sounds longer than a 16th note. Well, maybe you need to try using less milliseconds, right? So play around with these filters, see which one you like. I do prefer to use this sort of shark fin facing this way, and that would sound like this. So now, because that sound is very short, like I showed you, if we go back to the drum rack, basically it's just this little transient that squiggles off. Um, I would believe now that this 100 milliseconds is a little bit more accurate. So it it sounds like I'm getting a 16th note of uh, of sidechain. Um, and you can play around going extreme, and you really like when I use my volume shaper, I will duck the sound out completely for a 16th note. So to do that, you'd have to come down to infinity with the threshold. But I'm just not sure if it's necessary to make it cut through. And again, the milliseconds with this ghost kick, you might have to shrink them up, or it might hold it down too long. But let's give that a go. Obviously, it has more dB to travel from minus 30 to back up to it's whatever baseline is, not zero, but whatever that baseline volume is at full volume. So let's try it on infinity, because you really would, if you were going to use the compressor, you'd want it to duck out completely. So let's try that. See, so I do like that. It's definitely cutting through for sure. Using the ghost track, it doesn't take too much time to come back with 100 milliseconds. And if it was, you can play around with that. But right now we're ducking it out completely so that kick and snare can sound through the bass for a complete 16th note. Um, and it's coming back, through this filter, sort of in that shark fin manner. And so what I would then do is, once I got my sidechain dialed in on my compressor, you could just copy that over to your subgroup, right? Um, so now I got it on my sub. It's still sidechain with the same track, so they'll be affected identically. And then, typically uh, on vocals, something like this, where it's an electronic song. Those vocals are an element. It's not. The song doesn't revolve around the vocals per se. Um, I actually would sidechain. I have a sidechain on here for the kick and snare. Um, but let's add this new one that I just put in. So everything is cohesive and the same. And what I would do, if there was no kick and snare playing like it is in the intro of the song, you could just uh, automate that. So you'd come down here. I got my automation already on. I'd go to my compressor and I'd go to device on. So and this could go for anything vocal wise if you wanted to sidechain it during your drop. So I got it off here in the intro, and then when the drop comes in, and maybe I'll go a little sooner than that, just so it's not turning on when the kicks hit. Actually, I got a couple kicks that happen as sort of a miniature build up into the drop. Now the sidechain will be off during the intro, and then at the drop it'll come on. So I'm gonna unmute that, and let's give this a go.
Ain't no competition when I'm in my zone. No competition when I'm in my
Sorry, subs muted.
competition when I'm in my
So even still, once I put everything in the song, it does sound like the sidechain is a little exaggerated. Um, we could figure out how many milliseconds that uh, that little 808 click noise is, affecting the song, for how long that song is before that starts to do its thing as far as coming back with the release. But uh, for me, I probably would end up pulling this release down to like 30 milliseconds or so, because I don't like it to be over exaggerated in that way. I almost like my sidechain to be unnoticeable, like just the kick and snare cutting through. Um, Whether or not they're sidechain or not, that's not really the point. It's a mixing technique. that can be used in various different ways. Uh, as far as like in other elements, some people will put a quarter note sidechain on a synth just to give it almost like an LFO effect. But for mixing purposes, I almost like it to be unnoticeable. Like you can't hear the sounds coming back. It's just the kick and snare cutting through. So in short, side chaining with the compressor, with the kick and snare, during writing. When you're done, make that ghost track. Play around with different sounds. Play around with the milliseconds. Um, but this is how you use sidechain compression to duck all the sounds in your track, so the kick and snare can cut through your mix, and you can rock a dance floor. So I hope this was informational, um, and thanks for watching. Until next time, this is Revs again in the bedroom making music.